Hello,
That's it.
everyone. My name is Justin Essery. I'm an associate professor of politics and international affairs here at Wake Forest University. The International Methods Colloquium is a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Wake Forest University and Springer Publishing. This week's speaker is Josef Woldense of the University of Minnesota, giving a talk entitled Interviews Are Not Small N Surveys, Upending Assumptions for Better Interview Sampling. And co-author Jane Sumner is with us as well and will join us for the Q&A. Joseph's talk will last between 30 to 40 minutes, after which point we will take questions from the audience. You can ask a question at any time during the talk using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. Like I said, you can ask at any time, but we're going to hold all the questions till the end of the presentation. And if you wish to be recognized to ask your question via audio, please indicate this in the Q&A box. Otherwise, I will read your question aloud during the Q&A period. A link to Joseph's slides will be available in the Zoom webinar chat window so that you may refer to it throughout the presentation. And now I would like to welcome Josef Woldense to the IMC. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for offering us this platform to share our work. This is, as you can see here, joint work with Jane Sumner and Berika Özcan, and this is still very much a work in progress. So I'm looking forward to the questions and comments that you all have. And as the slide here, or as the title suggests, our work, this project in particular, is part of the literature in terms of interviews in political science, which quite frankly is still, it's growing, but it's still small. And we hope that our project makes a contribution to this growing literature on interviews, which is such a crucial piece in our field of generating data and informing our theories and just many different parts of essentially what we do in our daily practice. And more specifically, our angle or our vantage point of this project is coming at it from the issue of sampling, or the sample of interviews. And so that's what we're hoping to do here, is to think up through sampling a little more carefully and hopefully offer perspective that is useful to practitioners of interviews. Okay. Now, let me just foreshadow what I hope to convince you of at the end of this talk, and that is the following. So what you're seeing here at the bottom are your interview solicitation methods, means by which you recruit interviewees, right? And on the left-hand side, you're seeing a rapport, and that is where you are building trust with your potential interview subjects. And after having done so, ask them to participate as interviewees. In the middle, you have referrals. Here's where you ask somebody else to lend their name to you, or lend their name in the sense that they will then refer it to others and then thereby secure interviewees. And then on the right-hand side is cold emails, just like the word says cold. Here's where you just contact somebody out of the blue, ask them to participate. Okay. Now, if we were to link, or if we were to rank these different solicitation methods by the response rate along the sort of crude measure of really good, good, and bad, what you would find is something like this. Okay. Where rapport, as you can see on the left-hand side, is really good, has a really good response rate, as we would expect. You have put in all this effort, you have built trust, and as a consequence, people are more likely to agree and serve as interviewees. And on the right-hand side, we have sort of the exact opposite with cold emails, right? It's this sort of abysmal response rate, and rightly so, in the sense that they don't know you. Why are you contacting me? Why should I make myself vulnerable and speak to you, right? And as a result of cold emails having such an abysmal response rate, it's kind of the ugly duckling. It's there. We all know about it. People can use it, but the response rate is so bad that it's just there, right? But we want to push back on this. We actually want to suggest that cold emails can be really useful for sampling. And more specific, we're going to suggest that increasing the response rate by just a little bit, which still places it well below the other solicitation methods, that little bit of improvement in your response rate can go a long way and have really significant positive effects on your sample for interviews. Okay. In essence, that's what I hope to convince you of by the end of this. Okay. Now, how do I do that? Well, for that, let me actually get started with a tweet. And here, this is Charlotte Alter, a senior correspondent and journalist at Times. And this is during last year's presidential campaign and about the battleground state of Wisconsin. And the big question at the time was vote switching. Those who previously voted for Trump, will they switch over to Joe Biden? Or those who had voted for Democrats, would they then switch to Trump? And that vote switching presumably was going to determine whether Wisconsin was going to go for Democrat or Republican, right? And so, in the midst of this heated question in this moment, Charlotte wrote the following, or tweeted the following rather. It says, "Hello from the suburbs of Milwaukee, where I have met zero people so far who are not voting the way they voted in 2016." Okay, and this presumably is coming from interviews that she conducted. Now, the criticism was swift, and one of whom, Jennifer Victor, a political scientist, who, by the way, she does interviews in her own research, but nonetheless criticized this tweet by writing the following. She says, "There are 3.5 million registered voters in Wisconsin. The margin of victory in Wisconsin in 2016 was 22,000 votes. Why would you think talking with a few dozen people in suburban Milwaukee would be instructive about 2020? Now, because this is Twitter, you're of course going to have the more pithy response that sort of captures the essence of this critique, and it looks as follows. It says, what is your sample size? Talking to a handful of people may give you anecdotes and a story to tell, but it's generally meaningless. It is what we call anecdata. Right? Now, that kind of critique, I'm sure those who do interviews have heard this a lot. In essence, the critique here is this, right? That interviews are essentially equivalent to small N surveys, right? That's what they are. But is that really the case, though? Is that a productive way to think about this? Well, let's take a broader perspective on this. Let me start with this, okay? If we are dealing with what we saw in this tweet, and that is vote switching, okay? And what you're trying to do here is really population parameter estimation, as we saw in the tweet, then absolutely, right? If that's what you do, if you're doing population parameter estimation, if you're using interviews for that purpose, then you are subject to the same kinds of demands that you would expect in a survey, right? However, this is only one of many goals towards which interviews are used. In fact, we suggest that we can line these goals along a continuum. And on that continuum, we would place parameter estimation on the very right-hand side of it, okay? And on the left-hand side of this continuum is world building. This is our focus here in this project. And by world building, really what we mean here is that when you think about us as researchers, it is very rare that the subject that we study, the world that we're trying to understand, our specific world, whether it be violence and civil war, authoritarian politics and appointments, whatever that is, okay, it's very rare that we actually come at it from an insider's perspective. Most often, whether it's a PhD student starting their dissertation or even a senior scholar starting a new project, right, you are really starting as an outsider to that world. And as such, you lack the most basic intuitions. Who are the relevant actors? How do they interact? Right? You have a very vague sense, but beyond that, there's really nothing there for you as a researcher. And so world building is in essence the activity of building that world for you as a researcher. Now, showing you this visually, think of it as this. If you, the researcher, in your beginning point, start out with a very hazy notion, very ambiguous notion of this map, okay? And that's the world that you're trying to understand. And the idea is to say that what interviews allow you to do is that gradually, as you talk to more and more people, you conduct your interviews, that world begins becoming clearer and clearer and clearer. Okay, that's world building. That's where you start to understand the sort of, if you will, the principles of that world, the sort of physics of that world. Or to borrow from the world of fiction, here's how they describe world building, where we know, in the world of fiction, that's what you have to do constantly, create these fictitious world. And here's how it is described. It says that world building is the act of sketching out the formal aspects design and ontological rules and infrastructures that hold that world together and organize its data. Okay. So it's not even just about using the data to make an inference, but even understanding what are the organizing principles here, right? Uh, on which then that data is based, or in some ways, the analogy is when we say, what's the data generating process? Right? Well, if you don't even understand the setting, it's very difficult for you to even grasp what the data generating process is. Okay. So this is really the point here about world building. Now, interviews are particularly well suited to help researchers engage in world building. Okay? And here I'm drawing on this book, Field Research in Political Science, published in 2015 by Kopaszewski, McLean, and Reed. And here's what they're saying about interviews as it relates to world building. Okay? Here's what they say about the interviewer, more generally, that is. They say, in general, the researcher acts as a provocateur. He poses stimulating questions, listening actively as he probes and moves the interview forward to cover an array of topics or questions. In-depth interviews are often characterized as conversational, but the interviewee usually spends more time talking than the researcher. So, in other words, interviews really enable you, the researcher, to probe and ask about these different neighborhoods of that map that I'm showing you above, right? Where you can start to respond to what your interviewer is saying and then further expand on that so that you can get a better and better idea of what that world is like. Okay. So, just to give you an illustration of just how relevant world building is, I want to give you an example here by an economist on Twitter asking fellow economists, which you all know are not necessarily known for doing qualitative research, but nonetheless ask here, if you're an economist and you've done qualitative research, tell me about it. I'm interested in hearing about it. And responding to him is Scott Cunningham, who just published his book called Inference, the Mixtape. Really good book. And in his research on sex workers, uh, Scott Cunningham, as you would assume, does causal inference. That is, he does parameter estimation. That's what he does. That's what he, this is bread and butter. And yet, despite that, here is how he responds to this question. He says that for my sex work research, I interviewed around 700 sex workers who advertised online. Of those, I guess I did 20 or so qualitative phone interviews. Felt like the qualitative research informed everything I did the next decade. Okay. So you can see that even here, even though he does parameter estimation, you can see that world building fundamentally informs how he even goes about it, what kind of data he's trying to generate, okay? And how he then processes it in some sense, okay? So world building in that sense, it's really deeply embedded in what we do as researchers. And it is crucial that we articulate it as a distinct goal from parameter estimation. And the reasons are many, and one of which that we're going to get into here is really thinking about the sampling process. Because if we're not careful, the kinds of evaluative frameworks that we have available for parameter estimation, they really only awkwardly, if not poorly, fit onto world building. At best, they slightly distort what the research process is like, and at worst, it can be very misleading and really be hampering the research. Okay. And here on the sampling end of things is one example. Right? So when we think of conventional survey research, what is the sampling supposed to look like? Well, you take a random sample from a population. Makes sense. You get the desirable properties of if the sample is big enough and random, it's going to be representative, hence allowing you to make an inference about the population. However, that is not the case, or very rarely the case for interviews. Okay? If you look at the literature, the one thing you'll see them, that scholars will emphasize is the practice of snowball sampling. That is, you asking other people. In other words, what you're doing is not sampling from a random or from a population randomly. Instead, you are sampling from something like this, a network of people. Right? Notice they're not separate from each other, they're connected to each other in some ways. And what snowball sampling really is telling you, and I apologize for making this analogy since we're all in the midst of a pandemic, but I think it's really apt to what's happening here. And that is the researcher, in some ways, acts like a virus. And what is it that a virus does in order to spread? Well, it has to do two things. One, it needs to first get access to the network. That's the first thing, right? And in the same way, researchers do the same thing here. And then subsequent to that, once you've gained access, what you do is use the person that you now are interviewing and enable you, or you take advantage of the network properties. So that is by way of referrals. So the person that you interviewed then refers you to others, then they in turn refer you to others, right? So what you're doing is you gain access, and then from there, use network properties to further make your way through the network. Right? So that's the sampling process that you're essentially following here. Okay, so it's not random, right? And it's certainly not dealing with a set of individuals who are independent from each other. Okay, and so giving you a slightly different view on this. Right? So first, the first step, if this is the network, so in red, that is your access point, and then subsequent to that, you use the linkages of those nodes to then further secure more interviews and more interviews, i.e., making your way deeper and deeper into the network. Okay. Now, the linkage between this process of sort of making your way through the network and world building is this. So, if again you start with this picture that is hazy, right, you gradually gain access to the network. And then, as you make your way through the network, right, that world begins making more and more sense. And so here you're seeing it laid out in terms of these steps, right? In period one, when you just gain access, all the way to period three, where you begin starting to have a much better idea of that world that you're dealing with. Okay, that's the link between the two. And so if we take a step back now and think about world building, sort of what are the building blocks here? We would suggest the following. One, as a researcher, what you want, right, in order to understand this world, is you want to have different perspectives. And the link here is to say that different nodes in the network will occupy different places or different neighborhoods in that world that you're trying to understand. And so what you want is you want to have these different nodes that you can speak to so you can, again, explore different parts of their world and build it, right? Create that mental map for you. The second is query. That is, even if you're a good researcher, right? The basic point is that um, the extent to which you understand the world is a product of the kinds of questions that you ask, right? So you have your interviewees who act as a portal for you to access that world, but you have to, in some ways, prod them and question them or ask them the right question so they can tell you about these parts that you're trying to learn about the parts of this world. Okay. Now we want to combine these two things, and now think about what I was just showing you with the sample coming from a network, and that is that the researcher constructs the world through successive interviews. Okay, nodes are consulted sequentially, not concomitantly. So this is unlike in survey research, conventional survey research. What do? You get your sample, you get it in, and then you analyze it all at the same time. But that's of course not how interviews work. You do it sequentially. And in fact, what you're doing is, as an interviewer, you're learning along the way. So each interview that you're conducting enables you to learn something about that world. As you learn more about that world, you take that knowledge to your next interview so that you can ask better question, more pointed question, and thereby explore new parts of that world. So there's this iterative learning happening. Okay. And so the question, or the way we want to think about sampling then, is how can we improve the sampling, or how can we think about sampling so that it both improves the perspectives and the kinds of questions that the research can ask. And that is exactly what we're going to do here. Okay. So just to come back to just contrast this, as I was saying, right? If you do parameter estimation, yes, all the sort of rules of conventional survey research apply. However, if you do world building, right, we want to distinguish it because, as I was just showing you, the sampling process itself looks quite different. Okay, so let's apply that principle, or the sort of the network perspective, to this earlier point that I was making about the response rate. Okay, because now what we're going to do is we're going to say the following. We're going to take this idea of cold email and we're going to place it in the context of networks, as I was just describing. And here's the crucial analytic connection that we're making here. We're going to say that cold emails is the equivalent of gaining you access to the network. All right. That's how we're going to think of it. Or in network jargon, we would call it setting a network seed, or setting the network seeds. Okay. So we're going to think about this cold email as setting seeds in the network and then that those seeds, when they sprout, enable us to take advantage of the network properties by way of um, referrals. Okay. So the key difference, right, is that unlike the strict response rate, where we only look at essentially this one-to-one interaction, you make a solicitation request, and what's the response rate? Here, what we're saying is you have to take into account not just the response rate, but once we think of it as seeds, it's response rate plus network effects. And that's going to have a really important effect on your sample. And so that's how we're going to analyze it. Okay. And so to show you the benefits or the benefits of cold emails, we're going to make a set of comparisons in a simulation. So let me start with the first set of comparisons we're going to make. So what you're seeing on the left-hand side is what we will call plain emails. So here, the basic idea is you're sending out the emails to people and soliciting interviews, but not really spending much time thinking about your audience. Just, Professor so-and-so, I'd like to conduct an interview, please, and so on and so forth, and that's it. What we're saying here with Wordsmith is that you write that same email, but frame it in such a way that centers the participant. Okay, so you're thinking about now, how can I frame it in such a way that makes my request for an interview something for them to even do worthwhile, okay? Something that they would want to do. So in that sense, that changing of framing, we're not saying it's suddenly going to shoot up your response rate to 100%. It's only marginal. But the crucial part, as we hope to show you here, is that small increase in response rate in terms of setting seats can have a huge implication. So how does that then look in terms of the network? Well, if this right here on the left-hand side is the plain email, so you have one access point, one seed, okay? Think of Wordsmith as essentially just a couple of more seats, okay? That's what you're doing. That's the difference between plain and Wordsmith, just a couple more seats. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to compare, once we set these seats, what is the network effect? So how does the network effect then result in a different kind of sample? Right? So that's the comparison. The second comparison we're going to make is between Wordsmith and rapport. Okay, and let me just be clear: we're not trying to suggest that Wordsmith email are better than a rapport. Okay, instead we want to focus on a particular aspect, a specific dimension about rapport. So that is, if we think about rapport as setting seeds, just like with Wordsmith emails. Okay, if you think about it, one limitation of building rapport is that you have to physically approach people, right? In order for me to build trust, I need to be physically there. Hence, the sort of there are limits to what I can do in person. I cannot be in two places at once, right? So whoever I approach to build rapport, most likely the people that I'm approaching already know each other. So in other words, what is going to happen with rapport, because of just the physical limits that I'm limited to, right? That the people that I'm approaching most likely know each other. Or expressed in network terms, what you have is a set of seeds that are all clustered next to each other. Okay. And so what we're interested here is to look at the difference, because when it comes to Wordsmith emails or emails in general, the benefit you have is you can send these emails to different people, to significantly more people. And what that allows you to do is essentially access the network from different places. Okay, you can come at it from different places. And so what we want to see here is to say, okay, well, what's the difference between having clustered as opposed to dispersed seeds? Okay, what is the difference here? So just to give you just a quick summary then, right, left-hand side, plain, where we have a few seeds, Wordsmith, just a few more seeds, right? And then the second comparison, Wordsmith and rapport, really what we're interested in is this clustered seeds versus the more dispersed seeds, and then see what happens with the network, okay? Now, what we're going to do for the simulation is we're going to have a small world network with 200 nodes, and we're going to run 1,000 simulations, with each simulation going through 5 periods. So we start with what you're seeing in period 1, and then we continue by way of referrals all the way until we get to period 3. Okay. And because our interest is in these seeds, what we're going to do for this exercise, we're going to hold referral constant across these different scenarios that we explore. So that is, we're going to set the seed, and then whichever one succeeds, whichever one sprouts, it will then refer to its connected others, its neighbors, and the interview solicitation requests will succeed at a 30% rate. Okay, so that's what we're going to hold constant. And so the crucial piece of interest for this exercise is this period one. Okay, that's where we happen to place our treatments, so to speak. So we're going to alter between the plain network, the wordsmith, and the rapport. And they're differing in terms of the seed structure, as you can see it here. Okay, and then we're going to see, well, what's the compounding effect as we move on in the simulation. And then here are the outcome measures. Again, we're going to now harken back to what I was showing you earlier, thinking about what is it that we're trying to really get when it comes to interview samples. So the first one is quite straightforward. We're just asking how much of the network are you able to traverse? So how many nodes are you able to reach? Okay, that's the first. The second, here's where we're trying to capture this idea of diversity that I was mentioning earlier. So presumably in this case, or the way that we're capturing is to say, we're going to use community detection algorithm to identify clusters in a network. And what community detection algorithm does is it looks at these linkages among nodes, and where those linkages are dense among nodes, it's going to assign them as part of the same community. And so the analogy here being that, those who know each other who are of the same community are most likely to be connected with each other, hence form these communities. And so for our outcome, what we're interested in is at each step, at each period, we want to ask how many of these communities are present in your sample. So that's what we mean community reach. And the third outcome is just a slightly expanded version of that, where we're going to ask, so as you see here on the right-hand side, that's the distribution of that network that you're seeing, the community. So community one is the largest, all the way to community three being the smallest in terms of its numbers. And so here we're going to ask, to what extent does your sample at each period mimic or mirror that distribution? Okay. So then here we have it, the treatment on the left-hand side, the outcome on the right-hand side. Okay. And let's go then to the results. So here you're seeing the three different outcomes: node reach, community match. And then on the x-axis, we have the different periods, so from 1 to 5. And then on the y-axis, just think of it as the closer you get to 1, the more complete. The closer you are to 0, the worse the outcome, so to speak. Okay. So with that said, here's the first comparison between the plain email and the wordsmith email. So here we go. So starting with node reach, okay, you can see that in period 1, the two are virtually the same in the beginning, okay? And here, if you were to just judge it by response rate, you would look at period 1 and say, well, what's the difference? There really isn't much of a difference here. It's really minute. What's the point of even putting in that work to think about participants and frame it that way? And yet you can see here that once we take the actual network effects into account, that the difference compound and quickly grow, so that by the time we get to period 5, the difference between wordsmith and plain is huge. It's a significant difference. And community reach and community match is not even a comparison. Just from the start, you can see that there's a huge difference in the diversity of your sample, which is, again, crucial for you as an interviewer, or can be really useful for you as an interviewer, because you get diverse voices, which enable you to learn more about that world, and hence ask better questions as you go on and ask or do more interviews. Okay. Now, the second comparison is between the dispersed and diffused, i.e. rapport versus wordsmith. And here is the results that we're getting. Now, for the node reach, you will notice here what we have done, again, because our focus is on these network effects, we've set them to the same expected outcome. So in period 1, you reach the same nodes. You can see that node reach here remains very similar in the two. But the difference really comes in the community reach and community match. You can see that wordsmith, again, is outperforming as we would expect, right? Because with the rapport, you start with a very specific community and then have to make your way into the other communities as you go. Whereas with wordsmith, you're able to access the network from different places and thereby immediately get different voices into your sample. And so you can see that, the benefit really comes from having these diverse voices early on in your sampling process, as opposed to with rapport, which requires more time to then catch up. Okay. So that said, you can see that if we only look at response rate as just that, response rate, we fail to appreciate what it actually has to offer. Okay. That once we take the network perspective into account, then suddenly you can see that there actually are great benefits you can get from cold emails and more specifically wordsmith emails here. Okay. Now, having said this, of course, all of the stuff that I've shown you hinges on this point that I was making, that you can, in fact, improve your response rate marginally. That's the sort of thing that I've been taking for granted. Is that really the case? Well, we want to find out. And so here we ask, this very question: do subtle changes in framing of a cold email increase response rate? Can you actually do that? Now we know in a different context, in other contexts, this very exercise has been done fruitfully. So, changing framing actually has real, positive outcomes. Is that the case for this specific point that we're making here? And to test this, we did a conjoined experiment. And what we did is we asked 800 participants on Lucid to imagine that they are managers, have them read a pair of solicitation emails, and then rate them both and tell us which of those two they would be more likely to agree to be interviewed for. Okay. And again, here the basic point is wordsmithing involves considering the incentives and position of the recipient and centering the participants, not the researcher. So what we're doing here is we're going to introduce a set of interventions, or as you can see here, to show you, if the plain email is on the left-hand side, on the very right-hand side, we have all of these dimensions that we introduce where we are experimentally altering and introducing wordsmithing in a sense: authority, time, confidentiality, and problem solving. Let me just give you a sense of what this looks like. So if this is the email that you would see, okay, I'm an assistant professor and so on and so forth. Can you, would you agree for an interview? We then start to create the following framing. So one, in this case, focusing on the problem. So we ask, can you help us correct the misunderstanding, help people to understand this particular problem, or help me understand the problem, or we have no problem statement at all. Okay. The next one is authority, where we appeal to your authority or just have no statement about your standing at all. Okay. The third is time. So we, in this case, 15 minutes, that being lucrative, 45 being longer, and then no statement. Of course, we could code this differently. We could code 45 minutes one as well, but for now we code it as 0. Okay. And then lastly, confidentiality. Are we going to hold this interview confidential, or are we not making any statement about confidentiality? And here the expectation, what we are interested in for this exercise, is not the specific treatment, but more so the treatment vector. So that is, the underlying idea is the more treatments the email has, the more wordsmith it is. Okay, and so that's what you're seeing here. So you can have, to just show you this, right? On the very left-hand side, you have an email with no wordsmithing, okay? On the right-hand side, you have the one that is, quote unquote, completely wordsmith, okay? And the question that we're asking here is it the case that an email that is situated more towards the right will be selected at a higher rate than the one that is more towards the left? That's the basic question that we want to understand or test here. And here are the results. Okay, so on the left, on the bottom, on the x-axis, you see the probability of selection. And then on the y-axis is the sum of treatment vectors. Okay, so no wordsmithing equals 0, and then full wordsmithing equals 4. That is, we've included 4 of these treatments that you saw. And you can see that the coefficients are all moving in the direction that we would expect them to. Okay, that as you have more treatment in the email, that is, as the email becomes more wordsmith, you see that it is more likely to be selected. To show you this a little more clearly, so this graph, what it does, it consolidates. So it's just saying 2 or fewer, treatments in the email, as opposed to 3 or more treatments in the email. And you can see that the difference between the two, is about 10% or so, right? So in other words, on this question of do subtle changes in framing of cold emails increase response rate, you can see from our results, it looks like it, right? That our respondents were, in fact, they were responding to wordsmith emails more favorably than non-wordsmith emails, okay? All right, so then let me bring it back together, all of the things that I've been talking about here. The first point that I was making here is that interviews are not small end surveys. right? It is crucial that we articulate the goal that interview is being used for. And in this case, it's necessary because it has an effect on how we even think about sampling, right? And as we are showing here, that when it comes to world building, and sampling here, is that it's much more fruitful to think about that sampling process as happening in a network, right? Where you're laying down network seeds and then taking advantage of the network properties by way of referrals, okay? And following from that, we've shown that you can actually see the benefits that then come out of it. That little bit of improvement in response rate for a wordsmith email, in once placed in a network context, really derives some great benefits for your sample, right? So in this case, what our basic point is, I was hoping you to show that it is absolutely worth your time to place that or to put that energy into your emails to begin with, even if the response rate itself doesn't make it look like that. Because ultimately, it's in the network effects where you really will see the benefits. Okay. Now, with that said, let me just close with a quote by Mosley, who edited this book, Interviews, Research in Political Science. And she writes the following. It says that given the lack of formal training in interview methods, some graduate students may believe that interview-based research is less important and less useful as a method. But nothing could be further from the truth. Interviews are an important and often essential tool for making sense of political phenomena. We couldn't agree more with this statement, and we're hoping that our study can contribute to this. And I think there's tons of room here for contributions on thinking about interviews and sampling and so on and so forth. I think in the same way that we're seeing this resurgent or this growing literature on causal inference here. Okay. All right. So with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions and comments.
Thank you, Joseph, for that presentation. At this point, Josef Woldense and also Jane Sumner, who I assume will be popping in here in a second, are available to take questions from the audience. Hi, Jane. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. If you wish to be recognized and ask your question via audio, please indicate this in the Q&A text box. Otherwise, I will read your question aloud. So while we're waiting for questions to come in from the audience, I wrote down a couple of things that I wanted to talk about. So one question I had is you draw a distinction between, and it's actually convenient because it's right here on this slide, a difference between world building and parameter estimation. What I'm wondering is, what is the content of a world that you built, if not beliefs about the causal relationships that form the phenomenon that you're studying? So in other words, if we go and talk to people and collect this information, aren't we just sort of formulating some sort of Bayesian prior or something about the interrelationships that we're later going to estimate, but the estimand is really the same thing, right? In both cases, the estimand is the same thing.
We can, yeah, I guess if I was to slightly rephrase the question, right, it's sort of the question of is world building, just as you were saying, a vague estimate that you're poking around and trying to articulate, and then sort of later on maybe try to get at more formally, more rigorously in terms of whatever tools you use. Perhaps if that's how you were to frame it, sure. But in that sense, I guess it's discounting to me in the most human way that we learn about anything. If, for instance, I want to learn about political science as a field, right? I might come to you, or political methodology and whatever it may be, right? I come to you, and just from that conversation that I have with you and what you can tell me about that world, how political, the meetings that you attend, the journals that you publish in, the kinds of debates that are currently going on, right? I think in that sense, it's perhaps a dizzying array of estimates that you're trying to keep track of. But instead, I think at some point that analogy, that sort of, I think, yeah, the analogy of estimates, I think, just breaks down just because I'm trying to grasp just the basics, which I can test, whether it's just talking to you or talking to others. And then, if it's a population parameter estimation, right, then sure, do it the right way. But I think that initial, what is the intuition here? What are the sort of the basic, the fundamental pieces? I think on that level, I'm not sure if it readily translates. I think of it as estimates.
Yeah, I feel like world building is theoretically prior in the research design process before you can get to such a fine point that you would actually be engaging in any sort of parameter estimation. I mean, you can estimate parameters out of anything without knowing anything about the world, and certainly lots of people do, but that's not a good idea.
I can suggest a possible link. There's nothing new under the sun, as you know. This is sort of related to a point that was made by Quine in the 1950s and 60s when he was talking about the problem with the analytic synthetic distinction. Basically, he's arguing that there's that any claim is embedded in a network of other claims, so nothing is necessarily really analytically true because it ultimately relates back to some sort of empirical construct. I'm probably doing some abuse to his argument, but the essential thing is if you're coming in with no such prior framework of ideas and beliefs, you can't actually do anything because those other things are necessary in order to even ask intelligible questions and get intelligible answers. So it seems like there might be a similarity in this argument and in your argument. I want to recognize someone in the audience. So Devin Cawy said he'd like to ask a question aloud. So I'm going to click I'm very excited. I'm going to click the allow to talk button and let's see if that actually worked. Okay, Devin, I've allowed you to talk. Can you hear me?
Justin's drunk with power.
Yeah. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, please ask your question.
Say hi to
Oh, we hear your kids too.
That's And my son's school just shut down because of COVID case, so it's so I actually had a question that sort of and maybe a thought question combo that follows on actually from what Justin was saying about, but it's sort of framed in terms of the conditions under which snowball sampling or small n interviewing is optimal or feasible for learning about what we want to learn about. And I guess I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on sort of this formulation, which is it's most useful in a situation where everybody who you might talk to, everyone who you might sample, has good information and about the same information about what you want to know, right? If you ask anybody, any political methodologist, like, what are the top journals in political methodology, they're all going to give you very similar answers, right? And so the problem is, in that situation, you're not, there's very little variation across units in terms of the information you get. The problem is getting access to any one unit, right? So the limiting case would be every single unit has the same information and the only problem is getting it, right? But you're talking about a slightly intermediate case where there are a few different, maybe major perspectives, right? And that those are embedded in networks, right? And so you want to make sure that you have a diversity of perspectives represented. But you don't need, you're not relying on sort of large N asymptotics because there's really no variation or no meaningful variation within each of those clusters. And so I think that also leads to a kind of way of thinking about how once you get access to the different clusters or different parts of the network, how you can test that assumption underlying the validity of snowball sampling, which is you compare across networks and see whether you get different answers or not, or within networks too. So that's just sort of the way I was thinking about it, but I was wondering if that was helpful. And I do think that if you think about it from that perspective, you don't have to abandon the notion of inference about population parameters. It's just that those parameters are like extremely high dimensional or something. They're like the multivariate density of 1,000 parameters or something. All right, I'll take my answer off the air, as they say.
No, in short, I completely agree with you. Completely agree in terms of we're just getting started with this project, but I think there's a lot of room even to pursue the kinds of the point that you're making, Devin, about like as a researcher, as you are conducting interviews while you're sort of in the trenches, how can you try to figure out that the network that you're exploring, that that you are sort of situated in a particular community, and as you're saying, whether you're getting different responses. I think there's much more work that can be done, that could be done there. But in principle, I completely agree with what you're saying.
I think it might help if I give an example of sort of where this project came from to help sort of illuminate this. So this project originally arose because I was working on my book, which is now in production at Cambridge University Press. Plug. And it's
buy the book after this talk. Stop by the table for a discount.
Go to the merch table, get a t-shirt. But I was trying to interview companies about this behavior that was hidden. So I was interested in the ways in which they were trying to get political influence, except the whole theory is that they don't want you to see it. So it didn't really lend itself well to the ways that I'd been trained to study anything, because if I'm right, you don't see anything, which is, a problem. And so I was trying to solicit interviews so I could find out, I could actually talk to people and say, what are the different ways that you try to seek out influence, if not through lobbying and campaign contributions, like the very things that are going to get you in trouble. And nobody was responding to me. I couldn't get any interviews. And so I showed this solicitation email to Joseph, and he's like, well, the problem is your email sucks. Problem is you don't know what you're doing. But anyway, this project grew out of that. And so in that context, you do have a network where the clusters there are two different sets of clusters. You can have geographic clusters because people are connected through things like chambers of commerce, people being companies, people within companies, because companies are people. And then you have industry clusters. And each of these are going to have pretty similar ideas because they follow similar playbooks. They work with similar consulting firms, just like what you're saying, but they work with different consulting firms based on their geography and their industry. So we were trying to get, like what you're saying, we are trying to estimate something in that context, some estimate, but it is very multidimensional. It's a set of what are you doing if not these things? And then, are you not doing these things? So I think that sort of hopefully that helps to sort of put some proper nouns or some nouns on these concepts to make things a little bit less abstract.
I'm not sure if you can hear me, but thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
Yeah, incidentally, we presented this at Palmeth last summer, a very different version of this. And Joseph's kid and both of my kids were all in quarantine for that presentation. So,
I was thinking about how my first thinking was like, well, a chemist would never interview a molecule, or a physicist would never interview a particle. But then I thought, actually, that's
only because
wrong.
they can't.
Well, they actually
Exactly.
kind of did, right? Back when we didn't have any idea about, well, it's not clear we do now, but we at least have a better idea. Back before they were asking well-articulated questions, what alchemy was essentially just mixing stuff together and seeing what happens. Very uncontrolled, sort of what we would not recognize as hard scientific now, but they were we wouldn't recognize them as experiments now. But they were essentially getting a lot of raw information about what was possible, what was going on, that then informed later more systematic, more structured work. And it's not that everything that they did, Isaac Newton, was famous for the things he did that were awesome, but he also spent a lot of time on alchemy. It's not like that stuff was like most of it was wrong, but it may have been necessary because you can't just start being a chemist, right? You have to start when you don't know anything. You have to start with something, and it turns out that something is mixing things together and seeing what happens and having a lot of bad ideas. And I kind of wonder if that's where we are, right? A lot of times we don't even have the necessary network of relationships to ask the right questions or to structure the right analysis, and so we basically just have to figure out what's going on in a much more let's just poke at something and see what happens kind of way.
To go back to the world building idea, and oftentimes our idea of what's going on and our sense of the world is formed by the literature that's already there, but that only illuminates the areas in which people have already looked.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you're very limited in your sense of what the world actually looks like if you rely strictly on the pre-existing literature on a topic.
And I mean, the thing that I didn't show here in terms of the continuum between world building and parameter estimation, you can place these different purposes along this continuum. So one of which would be, for instance, interview, theory building, elucidating mechanisms, or for instance, using interviews to then inform your survey instruments. Or you may even come at it from the right-hand side where you start with a survey and then afterwards do interviews to establish some ground truth, right? So this is the sort of in part the reason why we've established this continuum to then be able to place these different purposes.
I'm really excited about the application of simulation methods and network analysis methods to interviewing. And I'm wondering where you think the frontier is for future work in sort of applying simulation methods or simulation analysis to methodologies like process tracing, like interviewing, to figure out the best way to do them.
I'll go back to Devin's comments. I think to me, he's spot on in terms of making explicit. I mean, one of the beautiful things you can do with interviews is that while you are securing more interviews, right, you can just like an ethnographic researcher will be really diligent about keeping right the notes and reflecting on what it is that they're experiencing, right? In that same sort of analogous way, you can think of it as you conducting interviews, you are in some ways also a bookkeeper of tracings, like who have I talked to, what have they said, and then sort of compare across so that you can try to make inferences about where you are in the network. Mm-hmm. I think there's tons of potential there, and I've been thinking about that, but I think it does require more careful thought about. Essentially, you try to make an inference about the network while you sample just a little bit of it as you go. Right?
Yeah, I think broadly, we're a little bit concerned about quant and qual or being perceived to do that, but at the same time, simulation can be so useful if you understand the properties of, I don't want to say the data generating process necessarily in this case, because that's not exactly what I mean. But if you understand the properties of what you're trying to do, simulation is a very natural way to understand the best way to go about it before you expend resources, time, money, rapport, goodwill, whatever you have, right? It can be useful to have a good playbook. And I think that if you don't, people in certain situations are less likely to be able to have that playbook ahead of time than others. So I think that this is a really good generic method for setting out that playbook.
It also, I think, has the beneficial side effect of giving people who are very quantitatively oriented an insight into how and why these methods work, sort of speaking their language. So it may actually be equally or more useful for people like me who are wanting to learn about these things. And a paper like this is a thing that can appear in like political analysis and that speaks our language and gives us a way of thinking about, okay, this is what's going on. It's very similar to that. There's a Collier article in PS about process tracing, which I thought was really helpful in understanding. Mm-hmm. That's what I use to teach process tracing now, and I thought it was really helpful to understanding what was going on. Devin wants to ask a follow-up question.
You're really our audience.
Oh, So go ahead.
Sorry, can I follow up that?
Yeah.
You're really our audience here because I think that we're not saying anything that people who are really deeply steeped in qualitative research don't know. The
Right.
thing is that most graduate programs, at least as far as I know, don't train in depth in qualitative research. They train in the fundamentals of quantitative research. And so we think that we can really, in a sense, democratize interviewing as a technique by speaking to the quantitative audience.
And just to echo what Jane just said, we are borrowing from what qualitative researchers have been saying. And as you were saying, just we're translating it into a slightly different framework and language.
There's probably a value add too there as well, because you can maybe, figure out, okay, what are the conditions under which this works well and which this works poorly, and what are the conditions under which you wouldn't try this and you would, and so it has two things going on. So it might actually also be valuable for the community of people who are sort of already doing this. We're running a little short on time, and Devin wants to ask a follow-up question about simulation. So Devin, go ahead.
Sure. I just want to make sure I wasn't jumping anyone else in the queue, but I think that's exactly the sort of right thing to be thinking about. I do think there's an added value here in the same way that, qualitative researchers were talking about process tracing for a very long time. But having read a lot of that research and trying to teach it, it can be very muddy, right? And I think actually having to explain the logic of it to translate to in a formal way, and it's not that you want to do the formal analysis every time you do process tracing, but I think that it helps clarify exactly what it can do and what it can't. And that I think that links to simulation in the following ways. That you might, I didn't quite follow exactly the setup of your simulation, but I think what you might want to do is try to set it up so that the estimand, or the thing you're trying to learn about, is very clearly defined, and the characteristics of it vary. And so you can find situations, so you can sort of chart out, here's the situation where this works and here's where it doesn't work. So to try to understand, like, no method is universally applicable, right? So that, maybe you're already doing that in the simulations. I didn't see a paper, so I don't really know, but I just encourage you to do that if you're not.
Yeah, no, we're going to vary the parameters exactly for the purpose you just mentioned. It's the next thing on our plate that we need to do.
Great, I look forward to assigning your paper in my grad scope and methods class.
That'd be sweet.
I think we have time for one more question, and this is from Mariel Leonard. I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but I think it would be helpful for you to react to it. To further increase the validity of the population parameters from the interviewing network analysis, I would recommend using respondent-driven sampling rather than snowball sampling. So have you studied the difference between these two in your simulation? And if so, what did you find?
Well, I don't know, Jane, do you want to respond? All right. So from my understanding, and I could be wrong here, but the key difference that you have here between snowball as opposed to respondent-driven sampling is essentially, are you the one approaching the potential subjects and asking them, or is it the respondents themselves? So in other words, if I come to you, Justin, and say, I'd like to interview more methodologists, will you contact Devin on my behalf, or will I be the one contacting Devin? And the basic idea is that, well, if Justin contacts Devin, they already know each other. It's going to be that much more credible. And that's what's going to enable you to further have credibility in terms of the sample. Sure, absolutely. For our purposes right now, we're not making that distinction because really by snowball, we're referring to the more, I guess, general term that's usually used, which is the chain referral process, right? So we're not making that distinction just because it's not directly relevant, but sure, we could be exploring that as well.
And in the simulations that would most directly show up, and again, this is not exactly right, but it would most directly show up when we vary the parameter of the probability of the next stage being successful in recruiting. And that's literally on my to-do list for next week. So.
Well, we're at 1 o'clock Eastern, so I'd like to thank Josef Woldense for being our presenter this week, and also Jane for being present for the Q&A. I want to remind everyone the presentation will be posted to our website shortly after this broadcast if you'd like to watch it again or share it with a colleague. I also want to invite everyone to join us next week, April 16th, when we will host a talk by Alexandra Siegel of the University of Colorado Boulder, a talk entitled, Can Exposure to Celebrities Reduce Prejudice? The Effect of Mohammed Salah on Islamophobic Behaviors and Attitudes. Please see our website, www.methods-colloquium.com, to get more information about this talk. Thanks for being here today, Josef and Jane.
Thanks,
Thanks
Justin.
for having us.
And I hope to see everyone next week.